So we are doing chapter 8 of the text, session 8 in these. The title of the session today is Science of Productivity. When we talk about productivity, what are we generally talking about? What is productivity in a general sense?
Efficiency.
Efficiency, which means what? Outcome?
Fulfilling obligations.
Nope, not usually. Productivity generally means what? What are you measuring?
Faster period of time to accomplish something.
Yeah, so time is one of the things. It's your productivity is a measure of the ratio of your output to your input. Okay. So if you've got the same input and you're getting a more output, then you've improved your productivity. If you've got the same input and less output, you've reduced your productivity. Okay. So however you measure it, whether it's time, money, human resources, non-human resources, etc., what you're looking at are the inputs to the outputs. This is your ratio. Causes and effects, another way to put it, or with regards to the individual, the action and the result, because that's what we're putting in as individuals. We're putting in our action, that's the input, and we're getting a result on the outside of it. So when we measure both of these things, what we're putting in, what we're getting out, and find some ratio, this gives us a measure of our productivity. The problem is that when we look at productivity and when we measure it, we only tend to think in terms of the external. So how much time, it's an external thing. How much money, how many resources, how many human resources, how much in salary, how much, etc. This is what's going in. This is what's coming out. X number of units per minute, etc. Right? We don't tend to take into account the inner dimension of productivity when we do that measure. So the inner dimension is, of course, the human personality. So we talk about action. Nothing happens, there is no action without the inner personality. So the reason that it's so important to include the inner personality in our measures of productivity is because it's the inner personality that causes the activity, that causes the action, and it's the inner personality that experiences the effect of the action. So because the inner personality is both part of the cause and effect of whatever it is that you're looking at, it must be taken into account when you do your productivity measures. So when it comes to the inner personality, we're familiar with this, but we'll just recap it. We think of it in two terms, mind and intellect. The mind is, as we see down the left-hand side, it's the non-rational part, it's our feelings, it's our impulses. Not on the list, but it's an important one to remember, it's our impulses. Whereas the intellect is the faculty which thinks, reasons, judges, and decides. It's rational, it functions through logic. So with that in mind, we want to highlight two modes of relating to our action. Right? So he describes these in the text. As impulsive and intellectual. So when a person is impulsive, it's a concept that we're familiar with. What it means is that when an impulse arises in the mind, which is where we say the impulse lives, you don't get impulses in the intellect or impulses in the body. We think of impulses as being a mental phenomenon. So when the impulse arises in the mind, what happens is that impulse necessarily flows through as action by the body. Right? Now this happens constantly with, say, animals or young children. Young children have no impulse control. Animals have no impulse control. Whatever that pulse is in the mind, it has to follow through. So when we act like this as adults, we can recognize that we're not functioning optimally. We'll explain more about why that's the case as we go through. So the mind's impulses determine the choices, and there's a reduced efficiency of action when this is the case. The second way of relating to our activities, our experiences, is intellectual. What this means is that the intellect's discrimination determines choices. So this again is starting to define and describe the two aspects of the inner personality. The mind, impulsive; intellect, discriminative. When we're talking about being intellectual, one of the mistakes that everybody tends to make is to confuse intelligence with intellect. Okay, so we use this word intelligence here with a specific connotation. You're familiar with the phrase military intelligence? No, it means military information, things that they know. So in general, when we use this word intelligence, we're talking about the stuff that we know. The problem is that we tend to think of an intellectual person who knows a lot of things. This is not our definition of an intellectual person. And a person who knows a lot of things just knows a lot of things. That's all it means. They have a tremendous capacity to store information. They may also be able to recall the information like that. They may be able to explain all of that information very well and convey it to others. All of this is only intelligence. Someone whom you speak to on a particular subject that is very well versed, very knowledgeable, very good at explaining, we tend to think that guy must be a very good thinker. Not necessarily the case. You probably know people who are not particularly good thinkers and that they don't always make very good choices, but at the same time they're very knowledgeable on one or two or a number of subjects. So the reason that we talk about an intellectual person being very different from someone who is intelligent is that an intelligent person will not necessarily be able to guide their own impulses. A person may be highly intelligent, but if he has an impulse to, let's say he has a weakness for alcohol, so it's midday, he's walking from his office to another part of the town, walks past a bar, he sees the bar, boom, there's an impulse, go have a drink. So he goes in and has a drink. He can't control it, despite the fact that he's the CFO of his company, incredibly knowledgeable on a range of subjects. So the intellect's capacity to guide and govern the mind's impulses so that we make choices that serve our well-being is known as objectivity. Yeah.
So when you refer to intelligence, you say acquire knowledge and be able to perhaps remember it and even recite it. Would you still keep it in the category of intelligence if they acquire the knowledge, but they can actually use the knowledge in the right place?
Yeah, so if a person can use the knowledge in the right place, what that means is that the intellect has the ability to see the value of that knowledge and then override or rise above the mind's impulses and apply it properly. So take the example that I just used. The impulse, go have a drink, comes up. Okay, it's midday and I'm at work. So the intellect says drinking in the middle of the day when you should be working is not a good thing, therefore we should work, come back here at 6 p.m. Okay. That's using the intellect to guide and control the mind in a healthy way. So that's an intellectual person. The mere knowing of stuff doesn't give you that capacity. Okay. Because when you talk about using the knowledge, using it for what? If you're using the information you have to make a living, then that's still just intelligence. If you're using the information you have to make wiser choices for your life, that's being intellectual. And if you're using the knowledge to create something novel and new that hasn't existed before, that's also intellect. But you can have intelligence and use all of that intelligence to make a lot of money without being intellectual, because you're just doing what, let's say you have knowledge of computers. So you use your knowledge of computers to create a computer product that you can sell. It's not something new, it's not something novel, it's a good product, but that's not necessarily intellect. That's intelligence still. But he says this in the other text, The Fall of the Human Intellect, that the capacity in us to use our intelligence in a way that is novel, that also comes down to the intellectual ability. All right, so defining and describing objectivity then. So we've described objectivity in a number of different ways, right? The very general description of objectivity that we use is intellect governing mind. It's very generally what we think about it. Here he gives it a different sort of emphasis. So if you look at your life, you at any time have a number of roles. Okay, you're a parent, you're a sibling, you're a child, you're a citizen of your country, you're a member of your school board, etc. You've got a whole host of different roles. So when you are at your workplace, it's your obligation, of course, to act as the whatever your workplace role is. At that point, everything that's going on at home should not be coming in and disturbing your thoughts and your activities in the workplace. But this does happen. Why does it happen? Why do thoughts from home come and disturb us at work?
That's the way the mind works.
It's the mind, exactly. That's the way the mind works. So if the mind is powerful, what it means is that when you get into your work environment, all of your hang-ups, attachments and concerns and worries regarding home will flood into your awareness. And then what happens when you go home?
You forget about it.
You bring your work with you. So all the problems associated with going on at work at the moment, you're sitting at the dinner table and ruminating on those. Why? Again, same reason. That's the nature of the mind. The nature of the mind is just to ruminate on these things. So this is not being objective, because when we talk about being objective, it's intellect governing mind. You're not governing your mind in this case. The mind is choosing its own objects of attention. You're not choosing them. So he defines objectivity then in terms of these multiple roles. So objectivity then is the ability in us to maintain a general awareness of all of our roles while at the same time only functioning on one of them. So while you are at work, you never lose sight of the fact that you are a family man. So if 6 o'clock rolls around and you know I'm going to be here for another 4 hours to finish this deadline off, what do? You call home. I'm going to be late. If you were not objective and you've got this deadline pressure, what happens? You get totally involved in the work and you forget to call your wife or your husband and say, I'm going to be home late. You get home, what do you find? You 20 missed calls on your phone and they've called the police and so on and so forth. Because you forgot your obligation as a spouse, as a parent. So we have to maintain a general awareness of all of our roles, but don't let those interfere with the current one. This management of our mind, the ability to put a boundary and hold things off, and at the same time create a space where we have a focus of our attention, this is what the intellect does. The intellect discriminates. Objectivity means the capacity in us to choose the focus of our attention. I'm choosing to identify with the role of worker here, boss. And now when I get in my car, that's switched off. I'm now in the role of road user. When I get home, that's switched off. I'm now in the role of father, mother, etc. This is what the intellect has the capacity to do. If we don't do it, then what happens is what he says here. Our other roles intrude upon the present activity. What happens if you're at work and you're thinking about home?
Lack of productivity.
Bang, you got it. The inability in us to know what to do and to execute it properly and in a timely fashion because we're being distracted by other things. So this is what we're going to get to in the next one. The final aspect with regards to productivity is to go back to the strictly internal portion of productivity. When we have a project, we're putting in our efforts to get the output. Now that output is measured in both the external, so I make my profit, I have my widget that I've actually created, I've got all the things that are the output of my work. This is the external. But the most important part of the output is what? Put it this way, what's the most important part of every activity that you perform?
The result.
Which result?
What do you feel after you perform the activity?
Exactly.
How do you feel? The reason that we perform any activity is because we have projected or imagined that when that activity is completed, my well-being will be enhanced. All of our activities are directed towards a superior well-being, more happiness, more satisfaction, more peace, joy, whatever word you want to use. If we are being highly productive in the external realm, minimum stuff going in, maximum profits coming out, but I am stressed, I can't concentrate, I can't manage my emotions, my relationships at home are breaking down, how productive am I? Highly productive. Look at my numbers. Oh, just had a divorce, but we don't take that into consideration. I don't really know what year is my kid at school. He's 11 or 10. Doesn't matter. I'm highly productive. We're missing the most important part of our activity, which is how is it affecting our well-being, and only measuring the stuff that does not matter. Same thing at the level when you come to something like a school. What are we measuring? What's your grade point average? What's your GPA? How many APs are you taking? This is what we're measuring. The output at the external level. How many suicides has this school had, has this county had in the last 12 months? How many admissions to the emergency room because of mental anxiety? What are the relationships like within the school, within families? Don't worry about that. She's got a 4.0 GPA. What are we focusing on? What is productivity? But this is the most important part of our productivity measure. How does it affect my well-being? We don't give that any weighting at all, and it should have the maximum. Okay.